So it's time to move on to our next session. Up next, we have a session that is absolutely critical for anyone doing business in Canada or Mexico. We all know that legal matters can be a bit of a headache, especially when dealing with different laws and regulation in different countries. But fear not, because we have got an expert on board who is going to shed some light on how to navigate the legal landscape when doing business in these two great countries. So get ready to take some notes, because I guarantee you are going to learn a lot from our next guest speaker. To present this topic of legal considerations of conducting business in both countries, we are pleased to have with us Mr. Andres Abogado, who is a lawyer in each country. Andres is managing partner of Abolaw, a law firm with offices in Vancouver and Mexico, and his practices in the areas of international corporate law, business migration, trade, and international law, with an emphasis on foreign investment, real estate developments, and regulatory compliance, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America countries. Andres holds a Bachelor of Law in Mexican Law, a Juris Doctor equivalent issued by the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, and a Master's of Law from the University of British Columbia, with a specialization in international law. He also acts in a notarial capacity in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker, Andres Abogado. Following his presentation, we'll have an engaging conversation with him. So let's start. I give the floor to you, Andres. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Juan for this initiative, and also CMX Partnerships for putting together this very interesting webinar. The purpose of my presentation is to create an awareness of the differences between the legal systems that regulate the operations of entrepreneurs in both countries, Mexico and Canada, and to try to provide them with insights based on my experience of what traps you should avoid when coming from Mexico to Canada to do business, and also to help Canadians to understand that the things and the legal system in Mexico is quite different than here. So I'm just gonna share my screen right now. Just loading. Okay, can you see the presentation, Juan?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so the title of the presentation is Legal Consideration for Entrepreneurs Investing in Canada and Mexico. As other members of the panel already mentioned, Canada and Mexico are business and trade partners, and there are numerous legal advantages contained in bilateral treaties for Canadians looking to invest in Mexico and Mexicans looking to invest in Canada. Two of the most important agreements is the North America Free Trade Agreement that has changed names over the years, but everyone knows it still as NAFTA. Now it's called CUSMA, and the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is also very important to take into consideration when doing business in both countries. It is very important to understand that Canada and Mexico have completely different history and also completely different legal systems. The common law is a system that was developed back in the 15th and 16th century in Britain, and that system is the one that most of the countries that were ruled or had an influence from Britain use in their current business transactions in the world. These countries are India, Singapore, United States, and Canada is one of them, with the exception of Quebec. The civil law legal system is a completely different legal system than the common law, and it dates way back to the Roman Empire, when the Emperor Justinian codified most of the laws in Rome. After that, Napoleon ordered to make a compilation of the rules back in Europe, and then the Germans ended up having more techniques to polish them. This is the system that was brought by the Spanish to Mexico, and it's a codified system. This is extremely important to understand because when people come to do business from Mexico to Canada, and Canadians going to Mexico, they actually don't stop and think, I mean, not only in a country that speaks a completely different language, but also in a country that the legal system is completely different. Canada, except the province of Quebec, which is very similar than Mexico, mainly regulates business relationships under the principles of the common law legal system, as I mentioned, which is mostly uncodified and based on precedents and case law. This is very, very important to understand. For example, there is no code of to regulate contracts in Canada. Mexico, there is a civil code that has an entire section that speaks about contracts and its regulations. There are some exceptions, though, to the rule. For example, in British Columbia and other provinces, there is the Business Corporation Act, which will be the equivalent a little bit of the Code of Commerce, but not as expansive, that regulates of how a company should be set up. Mexico regulates businesses, as I mentioned, under the principles of a civil law and commercial system, which is mostly codified. So when I'm speaking about codification and non-codification, it means that the majority of rules that entrepreneurs and business people have to follow come in Canada from a lot of precedents that judges made. And in Mexico, they come from written rules that are created by the Congress. It's very important to understand. So there is more certainty in civil law jurisdictions when you do business than in common law jurisdictions. So I have a couple of examples. As I mentioned, Mexico and its states, which is 31, have codes that regulate the contents of agreements between parties. This is particularly important for real estate transactions. The civil code, in Mexico, we have a federal civil code and we have codes for each state. There is also a federal code of commerce that contains specific instruction and guidelines and elements that a commercial agreement must contain. In contrast, Canada does not have a civil or a commerce code, and most of the provinces, with except of Quebec, that regulates the contents of commercial and real estate transactions, and most of the commercial and real estate transactions are done through all precedents and contract templates drafted by mostly professional associations. This is so important for Mexican entrepreneurs coming to Canada to understand. Okay, so the importance of hiring a lawyer who could guide you through all the proceedings and plans you want to put forward, it's paramount. So many times I've seen people coming and they're tight on money. They don't want to spend money on the lawyer. They go ahead, they sign a bunch of agreements without understanding their contents. And then all of a sudden down the road, they start having issues and then hire a lawyer, and it's going to be way more expensive to fix something that actually have prevented it. Okay, so when you are presented as a Mexican investor in Canada with a contract of purchase and sale agreement or a commercial lease agreement, these agreements are actually not regulated by any codes. These agreements are templates that professional associations did, and most of the times the real estate brokers present you with those documents for you to sign and not question them. A lot of the times those documents are deficient in the particular case where the entrepreneur is looking to invest. Okay. Also in Canada, when there is a dispute and you ended up going to court as an entrepreneur, the judges are going to have to construct and interpret the contract based on what the parties said inside and outside the contract, but mostly on the case law that has been developed over the centuries, literally over the centuries. Whereas in Mexico, the rules are more clear and they're contained in the civil code, and there are elements for the contract to be valid. So this is extremely important for Mexican entrepreneurs coming to Canada and thinking they might not need a lawyer to move forward. So now I'm going to talk about corporate considerations to understand how both jurisdictions are extremely different from each other, and it's very important for entrepreneurs doing business from Mexico to here and Canadians to Mexico, that having a lawyer is extremely important. So corporate considerations. In Canada, you need to check the corporate structure. Most companies in Canada and in British Columbia are provincial. And you can make a company in British Columbia or a federal company with one shareholder. And there is something called social purpose, which will be, what is the purpose of the company? This doesn't have to be stated. The only time that you have to say what is your company going to do is when you reserve the name. So the most common type of company in Canada is called the limited company and has different denominations, which could be limited, Inc., or corp. Okay, so when you incorporate a company in Canada or British Columbia or any other province, the first thing you need to do is to reserve a name. Once you reserve a name, you need to have a distinctive portion of the company name, a descriptive part, which is what you do. And then at the end of those two components, there is words that say LTD, Inc., or Corp. Okay, a lot of Mexicans who come to Canada think, oh, I wanted to do an LTD, but what about if I do an Inc.? Or what about if I do a Corp? Well, it's the same company. It's the same structure. The only thing that changes is the terminology at the end of the name. Okay, so this is very important because this is a common question that I have from clients. And they confuse these denominations thinking there are different companies. And probably they confuse this because a lot of the times entrepreneurs that are coming from Mexico to Canada already have a lot of experience doing businesses in Mexico. And they know that the Federal Code of Commerce have 9 different types of companies in Mexico. Okay, so in Mexico, it's also important to check the corporate structure. This is also for Canadians that do business in Mexico. All the companies are federal in Mexico. Okay, you don't have provincial companies or state companies in Mexico. And you need a minimum 2 shareholders, okay, to be able to incorporate a company in Mexico. And one of the most important things about making a company in Mexico is that there is something called objeto social or social purpose. And this is extremely particular requirement that the law demands from people who are doing business in Mexico, because if you start doing things outside the purpose of your company, all those things that you're doing could be rendered invalid. And if you go to litigation, the chances of you paying damages or losing are pretty high. So I'm just going to give an example, okay? If you as a Canadian in Mexico wants to open a business that imports and exports, right? You need to be as much comprehensive as you can to try to include all the activities you're going to do. And this has to be in the articles of incorporation. If you start doing things outside your social purpose, let's say, oh, I'm going to start, I don't know, selling real estate, right? Those activities could cause problems in the future because your company was not allowed to do those activities. Okay, so this is very important to keep in mind. Like I mentioned, there are 9 different types of companies with different structures in Mexico. So the options that Mexico provides for entrepreneurs are way broader than the options that Canada provides for Mexicans. The second thing I want to talk about in considerations are the contractual considerations. Okay, I'm going to spend some time in this part because this is extremely, extremely critical for people who are listening to this webinar to understand. In British Columbia, contracts will always be in English, okay, because this is the official language of Canada, one of the official 2 languages of Canada, and this is where everyone speaks here in Canada and British Columbia. In Mexico, it's the same thing. Contracts must be in Spanish to be enforced. However, I have a law firm in Mexico City and I have a law firm here in BC. So when I'm assisting Canadians doing business in Mexico, I've noticed that, especially in the beaches, Puerto Vallarta, Cancun, Cabo, I've been looking in the past 5 years, the malpractice of realtors and commercial brokers to present to Canadians contracts written in English without explaining them the context and have them sign the contents. This is very easy for brokers and real estate agents to do in Mexico, but the reality is this goes against Mexican law. And it will pose huge issues of interpretations for a Mexican judge in case you go to court. So most likely, if there is a contract in English, it's going to be unenforceable in Mexico. This is very important for Canadians listening to this who would like to do business in Mexico, okay? You're going to encounter many people giving you contracts in English. This is not the practice. This is not what the law says, and you could get into a lot of trouble. It will be the same thing if Mexicans come to British Columbia or Canada and they start signing contracts in Spanish with third parties. That will be unenforceable. So stay with the language that the country has and hire a lawyer in that place to be able to assist you what you're doing, or a lawyer that practices law in both countries. Now, in buying and selling a business, I mentioned that before in British Columbia and Canada, most brokers for realtors will use these templates. And these templates misses a lot of information. So a lot of times Mexicans come, they want to rent a place to start a business, could be a restaurant, could be something. They're usually presented between 40 and 90 pages commercial real estate agreements, okay? So those agreements, 95% of the times, I will say 100% of the time, are extremely sided with the landlord. But because the Mexicans come here, the real estate commercial market is so tight and they want to start operating, most landlords have an attitude of take it or leave it, okay? You sign it. If you don't like it, find someone else. So a lot of Mexican entrepreneurs go and sign these documents, and then a lot of issues happen in the future. So I'm going to give you an example of one of my clients that went and did that. He went on and signed a contract, 90-page commercial lease contract that had a demolition clause in that contract. I told my client, hey, there is a demolition clause. Just bear in mind that all the improvements you do to this place can be wiped out if the landlord decides to demolish this place. And my client said, I don't think he's going to demolish this place. Well, guess what? 2 years passed and the landlord died. The state took over and the executor moved on and demolished the entire place. So these are the things. It's just a little example of many things I've seen for Mexicans to be extremely aware that if you're presented with a 45, 90 pages contract, most likely all the contents of that contract are going to be against you, right? And one of the things that I've noticed about entrepreneurs is that because of their personality and the go-getter attitude to do things, they just go and sign these agreements and think everything is going to be fine. Well, guess what? It could be fine, but if it's not fine, it will be a big problem. Okay. In Mexico, if Canadians are doing business there, in buying and selling a business, the contracts must follow the contents of the civil code. So that's very important to take into consideration. Now I'm going to move now to the business immigration considerations. This is also important for a lot of people who want to stay in both countries. Citizens of both countries can use the CUSMA or the CTPP to obtain work permit to operate their own businesses. Okay, so the North American Free Trade Agreement and the CUSMA allow Mexicans to come here and operate their own businesses, and Canadians to go to Mexico and operate their own businesses. It's a closed work permit to your company, and if you have an immigration lawyer who can help you properly, it can allow you to get enough points for a permanent resident application. Okay. Tax income consideration are necessary to take into account as well when you're immigrated and sending money from Mexico to Canada and vice versa. There is an international tax treaty between both countries. You need to get advice from a certified accountant who could help you out. Hiring employees as a foreigner would require pay Canadians or Mexican citizens payroll. Okay, even if the company is still not considered a tax resident. This is very important for you guys to understand. You need to talk to an accountant and someone who's expert in tax to help you navigate, because your goal as an entrepreneur is try to avoid the tax authorities to take as much money as they can in a legal way so you can keep using that money for your company. Okay, now another thing that is important to consider as a business immigration consideration is self-employed work in Canada is not considered relevant work experience for permanent residency. So if you come here, open a business, let's say you hire my firm to make the company in the work permit, and you start working in your own company, all this time that you're working in your company is not considered work experience for permanent residency. Okay, so take that into consideration. There are other mechanisms that are important to do to be able to get you points for permanent residence. For example, one of them is making you the CEO of the company, could give you 200 points for your permanent residence application. But your work experience in Canada with your own company is not going to be considered a Canadian work experience. Okay, very important to consider and very important to take into account. Employment law considerations. How am I doing with time, Juan? Am I good with time?
Thank you. We are almost running out of time. I will appreciate your consideration.
Okay, I'm just gonna finish this pretty fast, okay? So for the employment law considerations, Canadian citizens must be very careful to employ Mexicans, as the Mexican employment legal system is quite aggressive towards employers, and there is a reverse onus. All employment relationships must be documented carefully for Canadians doing business in Mexico, because the labor code in Mexico is extremely aggressive towards employers. Outsourcing employees in Mexico is illegal. That happened 2 years ago. You need to be very careful about doing this, or you could get in trouble as a Canadian. Okay. Now, for Mexicans hiring people in Canada, you also need to be very careful, because employees can sue employers not only for dismissal or wrongful dismissal under the code, the labor code, but also for human rights discrimination. And on top of that, they can sue you civilly in court. This is not possible in Mexico, but in Canada, it is possible. Okay. So employment agreements also must be carefully drafted. Take very, very close, pay close attention to these employment considerations. And lastly, before we jump into the questions, it's very important to consider the culture and language difference when doing business in a foreign country. The way you do business in Mexico as Mexican is not the same way as you do business in Canada. That's why you have to hire the experts that could help you navigate the system. The same happens with Canadians doing in Mexico. You don't do the same things that you do in Canada in Mexico. You need to hire people who could help you navigate those places. So that's the end of the presentation, Juan. I'm just we can jump into questions and answers if you like.
Thank you so much, Andres. We really appreciate you putting this presentation, key legal consideration for all the entrepreneurs in both countries. There is just one question. They are asking if you can just elaborate a little bit more about your advice for Canadian entrepreneurs trying to do business in Mexico. What do you think are some legal oversights that happen most often from Canadian entrepreneurs in Mexico?
Canadians entrepreneurs in Mexico have to be extremely careful hiring lawyers in Mexico. One of the things that happen in Mexico is that lawyers are unregulated. Okay. Yes, there is a license that lawyers get from the government to be able to operate as lawyers in Mexico, but Mexican lawyers are not bound by the strict oversight and regulations that Canadian lawyers do to their law societies. Okay. So when you hire a Mexican lawyer and the Mexican lawyer doesn't perform the job properly, or the Mexican lawyer doesn't deliver, the only recourse that you as an entrepreneur in Mexico has is suing the lawyer. And that is going to take you 3 to 5 years as well. Okay, the other thing is Mexican lawyers don't operate trust accounts. So when you pay money to a Mexican lawyer or a Mexican law firm, they are allowed to spend that money immediately before doing any work. Okay, in Canada, Canadian lawyers, I'm Mexican and Canadian lawyer, so I know the differences. As a Canadian lawyer in Canada operating here, the law society is extremely strict with us. And when we receive money in our trust accounts for future legal services, what is going to happen is we cannot spend that money until we actually complete the work and give an invoice. Also, we get audited constantly, and people from the public have a complaint proceeding and can call the law side and say this lawyer didn't do what he's supposed to. So Canadians doing business in Mexico hiring lawyers have to be extremely careful in knowing that Mexico is unregulated for lawyers, and a lot of issues could take place when you don't hire the proper lawyer. That's one of the main things. The second thing is all the things that I explained, Juan, in my presentation, understanding that the agreements must be in Spanish, and the agreements must be carefully explained to you by a lawyer. If you don't speak Spanish, you need to have a bilingual lawyer, and someone who can help you navigate the Mexican legal system, and also understanding that Mexico is a civil law jurisdiction, not common law. So the things that you were used to do in Canada are not applicable in Mexico.
Great response, Andres. Thank you. We really appreciate this. I think you have given us a lot of advice and practical advice, but very important. We are deeply grateful for the support for this initiative, for coming and presenting for us today. Your presentation, of course, has given us the, I think, important advice to try to consider either in Canada or Mexico. And there are more people saying, how can they contact you? If you allow us, we are going to share your email address, and they can follow up with you the conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. I don't know if there is a chat here.
If you can put on the chat, will be great.
Yeah.
And we really appreciate it, Andres. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Juan.
Thank you.